Hi, and welcome to the very first episode of Only Dan's. This particular episode is of two great friends of mine, Lisa Forte and Sarah Armstrong-Smith. I mean, I'm sure everybody actually knows who both of you are, but if you'd like to just give a brief introduction, that'd be awesome.
Hi, I'm Lisa. I work in cybersecurity. I've specialised in sort of crisis management, helping prepare organisations for various different cyber attacks. I'm also a public speaker, climber, caver, general, strange person online. And so that's sort of what I do.
Excellent. Thank you. And Sarah?
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Armstrong-Smith. So my day job is Chief Security Advisor at Microsoft. So what's one of those? So in essence, my role is to liaise with Microsoft's largest enterprise customers across Europe. So that's CISO, CIO, CTOs, all of the kind of the C-suite in essence. But I'm also the author of 2 books, Effective Crisis Management and Understand the Cyber Attacker Mindset.
And 2 very excellent books they are too. Right, so I guess the first thing to start with is, in particular, online safety. And I think one in particular is there's a lot of kind of social media scams that happen throughout the whole history of social media, really. And in particular, there's a particular nasty one around romance scams. Lisa, would you maybe like to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's not my sort of area where this sort of touches is more from the perspective of sort of large organizations that have a particularly sophisticated security structure and key members of their staff getting contacted online. Usually starts on LinkedIn, but it's not always, it doesn't always start on LinkedIn, by an individual with under the pretense that they're looking for some sort of relationship. They sort of manage to manifest a connection with this individual, build a relationship, and so on and so forth. And they're doing that in this particular case, not to extract money from the individual, which is what we usually see with a lot of romance scams with individuals, but it's more actually to gain access into the organization through a different means. And that could be things like sending links to that person at work, getting them to take in USB sticks, or potentially even asking them to screenshot information on their screens and then send it out as an image or a JPEG. So you see this particularly in industries that would have an awful lot of intellectual property, or potentially manufacturing industries as another example, places that have commercially sensitive information. It's not, to my knowledge at least, seen that much in sort of the appropriation of PII, because that's not that useful. But it's definitely used to appropriate commercially sensitive information. So we have also seen this being done, albeit less on the romantic side, by Chinese threat actors as well, in order to gain access to information without having to launch some sort of sophisticated attack on an organization that probably invests pretty heavily in security. So that's the type I've touched on, but obviously it plays on human emotions as well. And Sarah's done lots of research into victims and how this sort of thing impacts. So I'll leave that bit to her.
Sure. Yeah, no, thank you.
Yes. So like I said, so I wrote a book, Understand the Cyber Attacker Mindset. And I think a lot of the time when we think about cybersecurity, it's all about technology. But the reality is, as technology gets better and better at blocking threats, a lot of the threat actors are going backwards. So they're going backwards to the human. And the human element is really important with regards to what we call social engineering, the level of manipulation. And people might be familiar with phishing in particular. So over 80% of cyber attacks start with still some kind of phishing. And in essence, that's initial hook. So when you get these kind of messages, the way they're written, they're trying to entice you to take some kind of action. And this is the really important thing. It's really playing on the strongest human emotions. And so part of the work that I've done is to interview not just ex-criminals, but also academics as well. So some of the criminals that I've interviewed, in essence, they are sort of saying from that level of manipulation, I'm trying to either get you to love me or hate me. So you're either driven by fear or blinded by love. And I think that's a really good example when we're talking about romance scams in particular, kind of taking that to the next level. And I would say romance scams are a particularly awful type of scam and fraud in particular, because you really are taking advantage of that deepest human emotion. So you can love, lust, whatever the case may be, but it's really getting people when they're vulnerable at the same time. So maybe one of these people, and it can be men as well as women. So I think it's important when we talk about victims, there is any age, any gender in essence, but what they tend to do is really get people when they are down, or they just come out of a relationship, whatever the case may be. And actually, I interviewed an academic, Dr. Elizabeth Carter. So she is a criminologist as well as a forensic linguist. And one of the things that she did in particular, she studies the language that a lot of romance scammers use in particular. So she doesn't interview people. I think when people finally realize that they've been a victim of this type of scam, it's very emotional to these people, because they think they're in a relationship, potentially they're in love. This relationship could have been on months, and sometimes it's in person and sometimes it's online. I don't think it really matters. So for that person, they feel like it's a real, genuine relationship.
Yeah.
But I think that the cruelty really with this in particular, as I sort of said, is Dr. Elizabeth Carter. She studied the language in particular that a lot of these scammers use. So she looked at all of the different messages, the type of messages and the language. And not just the language, but also with regards to the times in which they were sending these messages. So they tend to bombard people all times of day, all times of night. And it's really trying to keep people off guard. And again, we see this a lot with phishing in particular. Now, I think it's important any single one of us can get caught out. So it's not looking at a particular type of person or a particular type of victim. The reality is you just get me on the right moment at the right time. I'm going to kind of do these type of things in particular. But I think from what Dr. Elizabeth Carter said in particular about romance scams, with the language, the way in which they talk to people, the way in which they actually segregate people, in particular from friends and family and various different things. This is akin to domestic abuse. And I think another interesting thing that she said as well is if people knew they were being manipulated, they wouldn't be manipulated.
Yeah.
So it's really easy for someone on the outside, if it's a physical abuse, a psychological abuse, whatever the case may be. I think a lot of people from the outside say, why don't you just stop? Why don't you just leave? It could be a myriad of different things. But the reality for that person, as we sort of said, Dan, is the fact that these people think they are in a genuine, loving relationship. This person or people, sometimes it's a group, and I think that's something to be mindful of as well. We have seen people, some of the attackers, they run it like a playbook in essence. So while they are messaging people at 3 a.m. for that individual, actually it's the middle of the day for them. And they might be running, 3 times 8-hour shifts. And I think the interesting thing, even from what Elizabeth was saying as well, in terms of the fact that they might run these playbooks, but sometimes they get it wrong as well. I think that's an interesting thing. So, for example, it's just the way that they speak. So let's say you're an atheist. Maybe you've been telling this person, I don't believe in God, I don't believe in anything. But actually, their playbook might turn around and say, this is fate. God's brought us together, because they kind of play again at those human emotions. And you might turn around and say, well, I'm pretty sure I told you I don't believe in those things. But this is the kind of thing. And sometimes they get it wrong. Sometimes they pick the playbook up in the wrong place. So they'll start to say the same message over and over again. And this is when people start to kind of click on. So it is quite complicated. I think people just think, this is just random people who are randomly messaging people and just it's potluck. And this is why I'm saying romance scams in particular are incredibly intrusive. They're incredibly cruel. And there's a real emotiveness behind some of these things as well in particular.
I think also one of the things that's really perfect about them from a scam perspective is that generally speaking in relationships, just generally, most people will have recalled a situation where you have a friend, for example, who's dating someone rather unsavory, and you sort of say, look, I don't think this is a good guy, or this woman's not right for you. They don't listen, because the problem is when you're in that situation and you're enamored with someone and you think this person's amazing, you don't listen. And so actually that's what makes them perfect, because someone's saying to you, look, I think this person's out for your money. If you're in that, and this is the only way you can understand it, really, is if you're actually that person. Because if you're in that moment and you're feeling those feelings, and really it's being driven by emotions and hormones and all the other things that are playing a part, you're not listening and you're not being logical. And that happens whether it's just an unsavory person that you happen to be dating, or it's the case in these situations. And so it's almost the perfect cover, because those people are very unlikely to go, oh, my friend Sarah said this gentleman is horrible, so I just won't date him anymore. Very rarely does that happen.
Yeah. I think just to add to that as well, I think the other thing that was quite interesting is when people have given money, so whatever the case may be, and it normally starts small. Mm-hmm. And what we find with a lot of these things in particular is that they have never actually asked the victim for the fast payment. So what they might turn around and say is, oh, the reason I can't call you, or the reason I can't come and see you, or the reason I can't do a myriad of different things, my phone was stolen, I lost my wallet, or they'll come up with some story. Now, what then tends to happen is, as you would in any relationship, I mean, it doesn't have to be a romantic relationship. It could be, if you think you're a good friend, you would offer to give that person some money. Mm-hmm. Maybe borrow my phone, do all these things. And so you have willingly given that money or whatever, their products or anything else. So it starts small and it builds up.
And they usually pay it back. The first few, they'll usually pay back. And that's why you're like, oh, this isn't a scam, because they've paid me the money back. So why wouldn't I now give them money again? Because they've just built up this reciprocity.
Yes, exactly. And I think the interesting thing is a lot of those people don't realize it's fraud. But this is an example of advance payment fraud, and it is misrepresentation. So I think when people are in this situation, I think, oh my goodness, I'm so silly, I'm so stupid, I can't believe I did this, I've been giving this person money. They are probably less likely to report it to the police. They're probably less likely to even think it's fraud, and they just kind of go into their shell and think, how silly I am. But I think the most important thing is this is the game plan of the fraudster. They are willing to invest time and effort into this. And as I say, they start small, they go big. And I think this is the thing, is that when people are in this situation, as we sort of, someone from looking out, going in, it's very easy for any one of us to be able to sit there and go, you're being scammed. This person's taking advantage of you. This person doesn't love you. But part of the ruse and how they build that up is they're deliberately separating those individuals from their loved ones, their friends. And again, this is why Elizabeth was saying, this is why it's akin to domestic abuse, because I think people who are in that situation, they can't leave because they become so dependent on that person and that individual. Maybe it's because it's the way they entice them, they keep them on this hook. And that's the important thing. They have to keep them on this hook. There has to be a level of tension there to keep that person interested and to keep that person part of the scam. But ultimately, as Lisa was sort of saying, it goes small, that there might be a bit of tooth throwing between, as Lisa was quite rightly saying, sometimes they will pay the money back. Sometimes they feel like it is genuine, because if you're constantly giving with nothing back, then you're going to start questioning things. And that's why they need you to feel like it is a genuine relationship, and hence you feel that love or whatever you are feeling for that individual.
But also, just because they're not asking for money doesn't mean it's not romance fraud. I've seen it in my line of work quite a lot with information, and people, it bypasses it because it's like, well, they haven't asked for money. No, but they have asked you lots of questions about your work, lots of questions about what you're working on specifically, asking to see specific things and you to screenshot them. And again, it's exactly the same playbook as Sarah's described. It's just you substitute money for information, and it's exactly the same playbook.
And I guess with that, you don't necessarily, it's not just people that work within the tech industry or within cyber that would have that. You might actually just have access to a building and be able to get that information, or do you find actually it's
very unlikely to be cyber people? It's more likely to be people who have access to intellectual property on some capacity. So you're looking at, for example, scientists that work in pharmaceutical companies, you're looking at engineers. It's more those sorts of people, actually, chemists, people like that, who are working on intellectual things that are going to generate intellectual property on some capacity, that are more likely to be targeted for the information, at least.
Thank you. I mean, this whole thing's fascinating. I, for one, thought that they were just automated bots. I had no idea they're actually kind of people actually delivering flavor.
I don't think you can fake human emotion well enough to build a relationship through bots. I think that would be too obvious.
Yeah.
And I think that's the key. I think that is a real playing to the human emotion in particular. So I think even when you couldn't really AI generate content or pictures, I think there has to be a human to human interaction. So there may be a slight AI element to some of this, maybe some automation, as I sort of say in some of those playbooks, because they might be running multiple people at multiple times. So they need to say, am I talking to Lisa today? And is Lisa in the UK or is she in the US? Because I actually need to understand not just the individual, I need to understand them. What time zone are they in? So even something silly like the fact that I would know the difference if someone was talking to me in English, UK English versus American English, because we spell differently. And so you need to know that you're not just talking in English. You actually need to understand the actual language and the culture that those individuals are in as well. So even popular culture, like what's on TV tonight, that kind of thing, or what's going on in the news. These are things that can get tripped up if you're not careful. So this is why they go to great lengths to convince you of them. And I think what we have seen as well is the fact that, where do these victims come from? And Lisa sort of said, from a business context, that might be LinkedIn in some of those kind of professional people. If we kind of think about more on a personal level, and again, I sort of said we're people at different stages of their life. So if you've just come out of a long-term relationship, for example, and you're thinking, I need to start another relationship, you may go on to dating sites, for example. And this is kind of prime territory, I think, for a lot of the start of these scams. And I think what's interesting when you kind of think about who you're mostly attracted to, and I don't mean physically attraction. So I think there might be a fact that people will be catfishing. They might have like very attractive pictures, let's say, to tease this person in, particularly younger people in particular. They might go for a physical level of attraction more than other things. But I think what's interesting in particular is they take your profile, look at all the things that you like, and create a mirror profile. So automatically you're thinking, this is like my perfect date, in essence. So, oh, you like to go for walks in the park, so do I. I like to go to the pub on a Sunday. I like dogs, yeah, me too. So all of a sudden you find all these things that you are mutually attracted to. As I say, not physical attraction, it's just the fact that when you're thinking about, what kind of relationship are you on? Do you want a friend? Do you want a companion? Maybe you are looking for a romantic relationship, whatever the case may be. And so I have to hook you in. And I think, again, so there's a lot of prep work that goes into this. It's not just the fact that I'm just looking for someone random and somebody replies to me and then I hook you in. To Lisa's point as well, is there is a lot of this is part of social engineering in particular. I need to know who my victim is, and I need to know what is it about that victim in particular that is going to hook them, keep them hooked. So I think, as I sort of said, it's a particular heinous crime, I would sort of say, particularly anyone who, I think maybe people don't think there's a difference between an online relationship or a physical relationship because they are invested in it. But I would think if you're in a physical relationship in particular and this is happening or those type of things, it's another level of cruelty in particular. But I wouldn't dismiss either of them because from that person's perspective, they are emotionally invested.
And I think actually if it's face to face, I remember Lisa in particular posting something a couple of years ago around the woman that had essentially given a house away, right, to one of these scammers. And I find that's absolutely abhorrent. Somebody that's kind of lived with that person for so long, spent a very long period of time, obviously, with them, to just take everything and then go one day. It's horrific.
Yeah, and I think the thing that I found, because I had a friend actually who got hit with this, and it was almost exactly how Sarah said. Recently divorced, she was at the time. Met someone online. She was a very intelligent woman. She wasn't, at all a stupid woman. She was a lawyer, quite a high-powered lawyer in the city. She was very, very sharp. Met someone online, built this relationship that escalated very, very quickly online, probably due, I think, to in part her desire to have that partner, that contact again, which was played on. And then, it started off with them asking for a little bit of money. They repaid it, a little bit more. They repaid that, so on and so forth. They then sent presents, gifts, flowers, other things. Like, it was not a situation where it was like, she didn't speak to him, she didn't see him on webcam. She did. All of that was how it should be. And this relationship grew, and then she eventually ended up remortgaging her house, long story short, to give him this money, transferred it, and that was basically the end of that, and never heard from him again. And obviously that's all gone. And, obviously, like Sarah said, a lot of the emotions that came out from her was shame and all the rest of it. But the problem, I think, with all of this really is that people sort of criticize and say, well, you should have known this. Why would you transfer this to someone you hadn't met? Right, but you have met them online, and I actually have lots of friends who have given money to people who they don't know. I've sent money to people who I think are my Twitter friends. Do you know what I mean? So, to say that it doesn't happen is really naive, because actually, like Sarah said, right place, right time, right pretext, and you'd be in the same boat.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing as well. There is no shame in this happening to somebody, right? It's actually something that could happen to anyone. I nearly got caught out a few times, I think, in the past. It's a very easy thing to happen, even when you kind of have all the facts, because actually you're right, they prey on things where, or prey on the situation you're currently in, or the thing that you're not going to question, they know, right?
And even if you take it out of the romance example and you put it just into people, even let's just say in our industry, who potentially are not who they say they are, or don't have the credentials that they have, for example. And they say, okay, hi, Dan, I know Lisa. I'm a really good friend of Lisa and Sarah's. I'd really like to be friends. The chance of you just going, okay, yeah, let's be friends, without questioning it, without coming to me, without coming to Sarah, are ridiculously high. And implicitly, you trust that person because only but through their own say-so, they've told you they know people who you do trust. And I've fallen for that. I know loads of people have fallen for that, and it happens all the time. So if that can happen, all of this can happen. And that's why we have to start understanding that this is so easy, especially in our community where we're very online. This can be quite easy to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I feel like I've learned so much from just that bit. Just so kind of leading on to this, I guess, would be crisis management within this context. I guess that does actually play quite a large part. Obviously, in fact, what is crisis management? I'm not entirely sure I know myself.
Sarah's written the book on it, so.
Absolutely.
I should just have one to stand up, shouldn't I? Well, it really is. It's about what to do in the event of an incident, but it's the preparation in advance, having done your due diligence, I think is a part of that as well. So it's about the proactive and reactive response to a major incident. And I think in this context in particular, it's about being resilient. So it's about anticipating that these things are going to happen. Well, what am I going to do about it? How do I prepare? And I think part of this, I think it's really, really simple, actually. Apart from stopping the victim blaming and shaming, I think as an industry, we are very, very bad at that. It's very easy to point fingers at people who've been victims of fraud. And let's be honest, they are victims of fraud. And I think it's the same in a cyber attack. We sit there and point fingers about how poor your cybersecurity is, how stupid you are, and all of these things. And we treat people very differently to whether they've had a physical attack. So if somebody, God forbid, was raped or attacked in the streets or beaten up, or they've had a robbery, we give them so much sympathy. But if you've been the victim of a theft, an online crime, or as we saw, a cyber attack, you're stupid. It's your stupid fault for falling for it. So we need to separate that first and foremost about how we talk about victims and how we shame victims, whether that's an individual or at an organizational level. But as part of that kind of crisis magic comes resilience, in essence. So it's anticipating, it's preparing, knowing what to do in a crisis. And part of that is then actually being able to ask for help. So you're never alone in this. And I think a lot of the time, particularly with the situations we're talking about, people just feel, I don't know what to do. I don't know where to go. They're too scared to tell their family, their friends, because they've been segregated. And maybe they think if I go to the police, people won't believe me. They'll say I'm a silly man or a silly woman or whatever the case may be. So that's the second part, is ask for help and expect help in return. But I would sort of say the biggest thing, as simplest thing, is stop. Because part of this, as I was sort of saying, is they're trying to emotionally manipulate you into doing something. And actually, one of the simplest things and reaction is to say no and to see what happens next. Because if you are in a genuine relationship and this person genuinely cares for you and you've asked for money, you've asked for something, it doesn't, as Lisa said, it doesn't have to be money. It needs to be something I can't give you. I don't have it. I don't have that capability. By saying no and then explaining why I'm saying no, that person, if they care for you, will understand and they will get it. So if they start applying more pressure, being more aggressive, kind of doing all of these things, then you kind of start to realize at that point that this person is not there for you. And again, bring it back to that crisis management situation, in terms of from an organizational versus a individual perspective. I liken this to if you're in the middle of a ransomware attack, in essence. So again, if I think about the attacker's game plan, I need to put as much pressure on you as possible. And so if you think about a ransomware attack, I'm going to give you this fictitious timeline that if you don't do this in this timeline, these are the consequences. And again, as I think about blackmail, there's a sextortion in particular, which is, again, really another level if we're talking about romance scams. So part of this, if you don't do what I say when I tell you, I'm going to put out these explicit images of their. So these people are at an emotional high at this point. Part of that is stop, as I said, is stop and think about what you're doing and to get help at that point. But again, if I liken it back from a crisis management and an organizational, I would say that it's the same thing. You have to physically take yourself out of the situation, stop, think, and react before doing it. And I think Lisa's probably got some really great thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I think from a personal perspective, and that I think it really applies in these situations with romance fraud, but it applies with toxic individuals as well that you might meet. Again, if you're looking at narcissistic people and other things like that, it applies to them as well, because again, anyone who is in any way trying to manipulate you cannot allow you to take a break. They cannot allow you to say, I need 3 or 4 days, no contact, I need to get on with something and I'll get back to you, because that's not how that works. That's not how they ramp it up. That's not how they get this dependency on them that they need. So I think that's a really good test. The other one that I've read about is changing plans at the last minute is a really good barometer of how stable someone is emotionally. Because if I say to Sarah, oh, sorry, I can't meet up for a drink tonight, can we do tomorrow night instead? The chances are she'll be like, yeah, that's fine. Or, oh, I can't do tomorrow night, let's do next week. And it's fine and it's stable. If that reaction isn't that, and it's dramatic and it's big and it's suddenly that you're this horrible person and you don't love them, that's a really bad sign that it's not genuine. So I think that personal resilience stuff that Sarah just said was brilliant. I think from a company perspective, I think if you are dealing with intellectual property and sort of highly commercially sensitive information, I think you do need to look at the people who have access to that and do some level of awareness training with them, because it's very easy for them to become an insider threat and intentionally take data and pass it outside of the company, but not really understand the context in which they're doing it. And that's obviously incredibly damaging for the individual, but it also is a breach of, highly sensitive, highly valuable information to the company as well. So again, it's about looking at that process, looking at how those controls are in place, but also if this information gets out, what do we do and how do we manage it is very key as well.
Yeah, no, great points. And I guess from an insider threat perspective as well, it's, I guess from a personal level, you may have family members that may give freely the information that you might not, even if you're very hot on keeping your information private, you could actually, someone else could leak your information unsuspectingly, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that it is difficult because people are vulnerable to this sort of stuff. This is part of the problem. We have sort of hardware that hasn't been updated for a very long time, and it's full of bugs and full of problems. And human beings are quite good at spotting those areas to be able to manipulate you.
I think just to add to that point as well, I think quite an interesting thing is when we look at schools and private schools in particular. So if you think about a lot of people who are in executive positions or they're MPs, whatever the case, so they send their children to private schools. And so we have seen instances where the attacker will actually go after the children. And it's going after the children to get information on the parents. And in particular, a lot of children are very trusting, particularly if it's someone in seniority. So if it's someone impersonating, just has to be a teacher, just has to be someone older and an authoritative figure. So if they start pressurizing that person, and particularly a child, into doing something or saying something, and sometimes it's innocent. Sometimes people just give information away. They might just sort of say, oh, where do you live? Where are mummy and daddy? Where do they work? What's your pet's name? All of that kind of thing. But you can see how that can start escalating a little bit more, particularly into giving some sensitive information away. But I think it's very mindful that when we're thinking about that victimology, and as we sort of said, is any age, any gender, at any time. And I think that's where when we're talking about awareness training, it really does go back to grassroots, because I think we do a lot of awareness training through organizations, but I think it's really important that we do that through schools, colleges, universities. And it just might just be one person clicks, in that conversation, or, oh my God, that's me. And I think people need to understand there are others of them.
Mm-hmm.
And so the more they kind of see these stories, the more that there is awareness about these type of attacks, how they work, how to overcome them, that there have been other victims, and this is kind of what to do and how to do it. I think it makes it a lot more accessible for people to come forward. But I think it also makes it a lot more accessible for, as you were saying, the insider threat as well.
I think also on that point, Sarah's point about like MPs or high net worth individuals whose kids could be targeted. There's this famous quote from this book, the book's name I have unfortunately forgotten, but I will remember it and let you know. But they were saying, is risk management a science or an art, or is it both? And what's really interesting about that is, if you think about Sarah's point for a second, you have a risk, you identify it, you put a control, whatever that is, in place to mitigate or completely eradicate that risk, right? And you're like, okay, that's fine. What then happens is the threat actor shifts and finds another point, and they'll find the next point of entry that they can potentially get into and exploit that. And your job, when you put this control in here, is to work out what the likely next points are that they're going to go for, and then address them. And then it shifts again and it shifts again. And so there is this aspect of creativity, which you could argue is almost artistic in terms of how you have to look at where that shifts and how it shifts. So I think it's quite an interesting one. So yeah, is risk assessment, risk management a science or an art? It's a good question.
I guess another point to that is, how do you approach those extra, once you have the control in place, how do you find these things?
Yeah.
I'm guessing there would be some kind of exercise you could do to help with that.
Well, and prioritization, like in terms of threat intelligence as well, looking at other attacks that have happened. I mean, there's a lot of information that needs to be pulled in order to make this assessment, which is why it's so difficult to get right. Because if it was so easy to just go, okay, well, we've done this, so this will be the next point, this will be the next attack, we wouldn't have attacks. It would be really obvious. So I think the fact that so many organizations at all levels, including at governmental level, have problems, as do individuals, and it's a growing and expanding problem, it's not contracting, highlights how difficult this actually is to get right in terms of spotting those vulnerabilities and knowing how to predict the next one.
I just on that note as well, I think there's an interesting thing around how do you turn from an insider risk to an insider threat? Because we're all insider risk in terms of just doing something wrong, downloading stuff off the internet, shadow IT, all of this. A lot of that's non-malicious, but actually the non-malicious can very quickly lead to malicious and the super malicious, which is the people who absolutely do know what they're doing. And they're doing it, and so they're bypassing all controls. They're bypassing kind of all the things you're looking for, because I probably work in IT, I work in security, I might even work in the fraud department. So I'm the person that no one's looking at from a trust perspective. But part of that is actually comes back to the culture and well-being. So actually having a good appreciation from what's going on in the world. And I think, if we think about what's going on right now in the UK with all of the kind of the riots and everything else, there's a lot of emotionally charged people right now that are being fed a lot of disinformation, wrong information, whatever the case may be. So understanding, so what's going on externally has a massive impact on what goes on internally, but also when we're thinking about what's going on in that individual's life. So to our point, as we started with regards to relationship issues, financial issues, and our different issues that are going on in your life. And you're only going to know that if you're a good manager and you're actually a good person and you understand your people, not just in terms of what they do at work, but what's going on around them. So if you start to see a change in that person's behavior, and they're going out of their way to change and do things and hide things, it might be that they are being manipulated. It might just be the fact they've had enough, they can't take it anymore. There could be a myriad of reasons why. We still are responsible for what happens next. And I think that goes the same from an organizational perspective, right down into those personal relationships that we have as well.
I think also we can't, I know that CERT in the US have steered away from using malicious because it's sort of intentional, i.e. I intend to steal information in the situation Sarah just described, but also like negligence and recklessness. That's still appropriating information in a negligent or reckless way. Yes, you don't intend to do it. You're not selling it. But it's still in that spectrum of problem. And again, like Sarah said, we've all got the access. If you've got the access, you've got the potential for sure. But other ingredients have to be there as well. And I think, generally speaking, and there are a few industries that I would say are exempt from this, but by and large, we are very, very poor and very, very reluctant at dealing or speaking about insider threat because it comes dangerously close to topics we don't like to talk about, like whistleblowing. It also comes dangerously close to what people see as big brother watching you, which it doesn't have to be. And in fact, a lot of the studies have shown that a lot of aggressive insider threat programs create insider threats because you feel like you're not trusted. And actually the things that work the best are things like employee welfare programs and counseling and financial service help and stuff like that. But yet we have this real reluctance to actually start talking about it in the same way we do with romance fraud. And this is part of the problem, I think.
Do you think it's particularly from an issue of what we were saying earlier, like there's a stigma of around it, or, if you have an insider threat in your company?
For sure, it looks worse. It looks way worse. Like from a PR perspective, it's a disaster in a way that if you have an external threat actor hit you, it's less so. It looks like you haven't got your house in order. The fact of the matter remains that actually there will be a lot of companies who have had this, but because it's not PII, haven't had to report it, and it's just been brushed under the rug nice and conveniently. And I'm not saying that is the right or wrong thing to do. That's totally their decision. But for sure, it looks worse from a PR perspective, definitely.
So I guess going back again, so one thing I know that you do in particular, Lisa, is tabletop exercises, right? Do they come into play at all with this particular element of crisis management, or could people do their own tabletop exercises for their own personal safety?
I think it's probably not. I think it's probably overkill to do it, at home by yourself. Like, I think maybe you might end up very depressed if you started looking at all the personal problems you have and tabletopping how you're going to handle them. But I think at a company level, yes, I do see this. It's not the most common scenario that companies really want to go for. That's usually ransomware and DDoS attacks, to be honest, because just purely from a threat intel perspective, that's what most companies are most worried about. But yes, from a company perspective, definitely have plans that deal with these sorts of situations. work out how you deal with it. And that includes providing help, support to the victim, to the person who ends up realizing this wasn't a relationship and they handed over plans to a new, I don't know, nuclear reactor or whatever it is you're building. That's going to be pretty devastating for them. But yeah, from a personal level, I think Sarah's given the best tips already in terms of resilience. I don't think we probably need to start writing crisis management plans for maybe for my holidays, but not for general life.
One thing I would add, which is again quite interesting when we think about scapegoats. So when there is a major incident, no matter how it's been caused, so we've probably all seen it, that person clicked on the link, you know, it's the intern's fault, it's always who we're going to blame today, oh, we sacked the CISO. This is all short-term fixes that actually don't change anything. Yeah. I think to Lisa's point, from a PR perspective, you can publicly show that person no longer there anymore, or they've been fired, or they've been prosecuted, or whatever the case may be. But actually, you still need to have that introspection and why this thing happened in the first place, and what you're doing about it. Because if it's just, we're just, who are we going to hang out to dry? Who's the easiest victim? And I think the interesting thing about scapegoats as well is what makes them a scapegoat is they're not very good at being able to defend themselves. So scapegoats are very unusually going to be someone in seniority or power who has influence and money. They were the people who can defend themselves. What does make a good scapegoat is someone who can't. Hence why they tend to be lower level, and they tend to be pushed on. And this is why you don't get whistleblowing and things like that as well. So I think you've got to be very mindful in terms of what your actual response is, and have you actually done enough to change whatever happened in that company that instigated that threat in the way it manifested. Because let's be honest, you know, all the people we employed them because they thought they were good people, and we don't instantly think that they're going to do something bad. I should say small things go to big things. The more you push things under the carpet, the more you let things go. You know, when people try and put their hand up and say, I've made a mistake, whatever the case, what's your reaction to them? So a lot of this comes down to culture of the organization. That will tend to be how well or not you fare in any crisis.
Yeah, I think Boeing was a really good example of this, because although it wasn't in any way cyber related, you know, it was internal issues within Boeing that caused the problems that were seen. And instead of dealing with those head on and making very obvious and, you know, proper changes to the way things were done, as Sarah said, what they decided to do instead was blame a few people, make a few sacrificial firings, that would satisfy the press, and we'll just carry on as normal. Now, obviously, that backfired, because then, as Sarah said, the whistleblowers come out and they say, well, actually, this isn't what's going on, and the culture's become more and more and more toxic. And then you're fighting fire with fire, really. So it doesn't work. And it, like Sarah said, you know, it might provide you with that short-term relief, but it's definitely not going to solve a problem.
I personally find, like, companies that are actually quite honest, that don't have it was because of a person, that actually say it was because of our area of code. This is what we're doing to fix it in the future. I'm much more responsive or receptive to those kind of post-mortems than a statement saying we fired somebody, because it doesn't really tell you, right?
Yeah.
And they've actually solved the problem. It just says that
I think there's always an element of whitewashing a little bit. And I think you have to be mindful that if you honestly think a company's coming out and going, this is how we messed up, line by line, bullet by bullet, that's not ever going to happen. And that can't happen from a communications and PR standpoint. That's a disaster. But I do think there's a difference between sort of the necessary level of transparency that we want and expect from organizations, and then lying is obviously, they're totally different.
No, good point. Cool. Wow, I think we're nearly out of time. So thanks ever so much to both Lisa and Sarah. Thank you for your time and your expertise. Oh, before I go, could you think of one thing that people could help with their own online safety that would stop with romance scams, or help at least prevent them?
One thing is just being mindful about how much information you personally put out into the public domain, and how that information could be used against you.
Great point.
I would say check in with your emotions for anyone you meet online. And if you think, does this communication match the communication I have with my friend Sarah? Is it about the same balance? Do I get the same emotions? Yes. Okay, this could be healthy. If I don't feel that way and I'm feeling agitated, or I'm feeling anxious, or I'm feeling emotional, or I'm feeling like there's constant communication between me and this person, probably a red flag. Maybe not a romance scam, but definitely not healthy.
No, excellent points. Thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, thanks everyone for joining in. Hope to see you in the next episode.
Thank you.